right. Well, today's workshop's title is Creating Infographics with Tableau. And again, the slides are available if you would like to follow along. There's a lot of links in here that might be useful, resources I'll be sharing. So you can find the links at the short link on the slide here. So that's bit.ly/UCR library-Tableau 2021, and it is case sensitive. So UCR library and Tableau are capitalized. And yeah, welcome everyone to this workshop. So before I get started with the workshop itself, I do want to pause and acknowledge that we're living through multiple crises, and of course the pandemic and other structural inequalities have disproportionately affected people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous folks. So as a member of the UCR community, I stand with Black Lives Matter, and of course with Asian American and Pacific Islander communities against the racism, xenophobia, and human rights violations we've been seeing. And I also want to recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples, as well as their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. And while we're currently meeting in a virtual space, I do invite you wherever you're calling in from to, if you're not aware, learn whose lands you're physically located on. So you could do that at the link on the screen. It's native-land.ca. Essentially for this workshop, whether you're joining us on YouTube, if you're here in the Zoom room, feel free to contribute and participate however you're comfortable. Definitely ask questions through the chat, and I will be monitoring that throughout. And also will be available to follow up with folks. So I'll start by introducing myself. My name's Rachel Starry. I am the Digital Scholarship Librarian here at UCR Library. And today's workshop is essentially going to be twofold. So we're going to start off by kind of demystifying some of the processes and approaches that go into, writing a narrative about data and kind of creating data visualizations and, infographics that are essentially data stories, right? So it's often called storytelling with data. So we'll talk about some terminology and approaches related to that. And then in the second half of this workshop, which is a 90-minute workshop, we will be doing a kind of hands-on demo with Tableau Public, in using that particular tool to create some visualizations and interactive dashboards. And it can be used to create, really complex visual infographics, and we'll look at some examples of that in a bit. Again, the slides are available for folks just joining us. I will actually, Margarita, if it's possible for us to share the live stream link as well in the chat here in Zoom. I know we have some folks joining us who are hoping to share the live stream link with colleagues or friends. So we'll get that shared in the chat. And the slides are available to follow along. So if you would like to grab the link to the slides, I'll paste that in the chat as well. Thanks so much, Margarita, for sharing that live stream link. And then here is the link again to the slides if you'd like to follow along. Okay, I think we will go ahead and dive into today. So I wanted to start off before I talk about, data visualization and infographics. I wanted to hear a bit from you all about what you're hoping to learn about today and what you're especially hoping to use, Tableau Public for. So feel free to introduce yourself in chat or share this in chat. And I'm actually going to launch a very brief poll. So you should have popping up on your screens a very brief poll with just 2 questions. So the first question asks, what your role on campus is, whether you're a student or a staff member or faculty member, some other research role. And then for folks who are here at UCR and affiliated with UCR, it asks which school or college you're coming from, just so we can get a sense of kind of who's in the room with us today. So I'll leave this up for a minute and then I will share the results so the folks joining on our live stream can also see what the breakdown is of folks joining us. And if you're on YouTube, feel free to share, if you're comfortable, this information in our chat. Yeah, in chat, someone shared that they're hoping to learn about making data more understandable for folks using Tableau. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the polling and share the results. So it looks like we mostly have folks coming from staff roles. We also have folks identifying as other roles, as well as some students and faculty. And it looks like we might have the most folks from a variety of different campus units and some folks from CHAS and BCOE and School of Medicine, and then of course some folks who are not at UCR. So welcome to everyone who is joining us today. Some folks are also sharing, just learning more about this program in particular. So some of the things, I'll stop sharing these. Some of the things we'll talk about today are specific to Tableau, but a lot of what we're going to talk about right now as we get started is more general. So this should hopefully be useful for you, regardless of what program you end up using to do data visualization or to kind of create infographics. So yeah, we'll go ahead and get started with this question of, what is data visualization? So I really like the way that Cole Nussbaumer-Knaflic breaks down data visualization in her book and her blog, Storytelling with Data. She makes a distinction between these two different processes. There's the process of exploratory visualization. That is, just that initial process of getting to know your data, make sense of it, see some of the patterns in it. And so the analogy that she uses is turning over 100 rocks to find just one or two gems, those interesting pieces of information or insight that, you want to kind of dive deeper into or share with others. And then explanatory visualization, on the other hand, is that process of sharing information with an audience. So it is telling a story about those one or two gems, those interesting pieces or patterns of information that you found in your data sets. So the kind of classic example of, why we even need to bother doing exploratory data visualization, this kind of process of plotting our data on a chart to get a sense of what the patterns are in there, is Anscombes Quartet. So that's what I'm just showing on the screen now. On the left-hand side, I have a snapshot of these 4 sample made-up data sets themselves. There's 4 data sets, each with an XY pair of variables. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, I'm showing how these 4 different data sets, which have identical summary statistics, get plotted and actually demonstrate that the distribution of the data can look very different. So plots can be really helpful for kind of making that obvious. So in this particular example, the mean of X across all these data sets is 9. The mean of Y is the same, it's 7.5. The sample variance is 11 across all 4 data sets. The correlation is the same. So this just kind of illustrates, and you can read more on Wikipedia if you're curious, why it's so important to do that exploratory process. But that's not what we're actually going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking much more about, once you've found, the patterns that you want to share, how do you go about designing some kind of data visualization or, visual means of conveying the most important pieces of information, right? So in this example, I'm showing an infographic that is at its core a pie chart of actual pie. So it's about Americans' preferences for different types of pie at Thanksgiving. So when your primary purpose is to explain patterns that you've already found, you want charts to be more visually complete, of course, than what we saw on the previous slide. And you'll often want to use things like graphics, text, annotations, etc., to draw attention to the main argument that you're making with a particular chart. So we'll look at a bunch of different examples today about that. And of course, I'm not going into a lot of details about the process of doing data visualization. I'm going to be skimming across a lot of that actually as we talk about using Tableau. But we have been recording our workshops at UCR Library during the pandemic. So we actually, on our YouTube page, so for folks who are already there, it's an easy click over for you later, but we have a playlist of all of the recorded workshop videos that we've done in the past year. And we did one last year in August on data visualization that might be useful for kind of, I talk about color and accessible design in charts, choosing chart types, that sort of thing. So that might be a useful resource to check out if you're curious about those topics, which we're not going to get into today. All right, so when we talk about storytelling with data, visual storytelling, infographics, what are some of the approaches that you might take? It can be really kind of intimidating. I have this idea for an infographic, or I have a piece of information I want to communicate, but how do I even get started from a blank page creating something like this? So I've kind of broken out this process of creating successful visual stories into 5 components, and I really like this this pyramid analogy because in my mind, each of these components, these pieces that go into creating an infographic, build on the pieces below them. So without, and the bottom of the pyramid is data, right? So without good data, the rest of the infographic doesn't really matter, right? If you're not, sharing something that is accurate or interesting about your data, then it's not going to be a successful visual story, right? So that's at the base of the pyramid. So the things at the bottom of the pyramid are kind of the most crucial to get right for the whole thing to work and for the rest of it to be successful. So of course, data is at the base of the pyramid. But then right on top of that, actually, before we move on to narrative, which is the next piece, I did want to share a couple of resources. I'm not going to click over to most of these, but through UCR Library, we have a number of databases where you can find research data. My colleague, Kat Kosier, is our data librarian, so she has expertise in helping folks find data. So I would point folks to her if you have specific questions about finding data here at UCR. But of course, there are a number of databases that we provide access to. You might look for data in some other places. ICPSR is one of the kind of most robust and largest social sciences data repositories. Of course, there are tons of other places to look for data. So there's a registry of data repositories called re3data.org that I really like. And you can, of course, read more about this process of finding data on our website. And then I wanted to point out a couple of publicly available data sources like data.gov, the US Census Bureau and Bureau of Labor Statistics have really excellent, provide really excellent data sources. If you're looking for survey data, something like the Pew Research Center is a great source. And then actually for today, we're going to be using data that is taken from Gapminder, which is a nonprofit that provides global data of all different kinds. So there's a lot of different indicators that they provide. So they provide economic data and data on education and environment and health and all these sorts of things from a lot of different sources. So this can be an excellent place if you're either if you're just needing some sample data sets to practice with these different tools, or if you want some global data sets to kind of work with and dive into. So I will go back over here into our slides. So the next piece on top of data is the narrative. And, of course, the story, the narrative about the data, that, interesting patterns, the gems that you want to tell the story about, that's essentially the core purpose of an infographic, right? So communicating a story about data. And all other designs, I know a lot of folks will start with the images, start with the color, start with the text. I've put those higher up in the pyramid because I think it is, again, really crucial to get both the data and the narrative kind of in place before you decide on those ancillary details. Not that color and text are not central, of course, to communicating effectively, but essentially, it can be helpful to kind of pause and outline, your kind of narrative, your data narrative, before moving farther in that process. So I really like when I'm trying to think about creating an infographic to ask myself some questions, that this kind of correlates to a lot of different ways of communication, right? So for anything, when you're writing a research paper or whatever, you also ask yourself these questions usually. So the first question is, really great to ask, who is my audience? Thinking about who your audience is, what they might already know, what context you might need to include background information that they may or may not know. To kind of bring them up to speed and contextualize your data story. It's also really helpful, and I think a lot of folks kind of get tripped up with this or try and cram too much information. It's really tempting, right, to create a really large or robust infographic, and include like 5 different important points. But our attention spans and working memory is limited, so it can be really helpful to kind of focus in on what is the 1 or 2 really primary key takeaways of your story, the most important points you want to convey, and then focus on those. And then, of course, it comes back to the data. What is the evidence that supports that key takeaway? So a lot of infographics will center on a single chart or a single fact or figure, and then walk readers through that. But this can be really helpful to kind of ask yourself these 3 questions. So, for example, if you wanted to create an infographic about the relationship between, say, declining annual record sales and the rise of music streaming, right? If your audience is, for example, high schoolers who have never maybe bought physical media, they might know some things different than other folks. If you're, for example, creating this infographic specifically for upper division college students, you know, who are in a music history class or something like that, like they might need very different context about this data, about, you know, the key takeaways than other folks might need. You know, of course, what's the key takeaway? So if you have kind of one, you know, really core piece of information, like you could include a chart or two that is demonstrating either the decline in annual record sales, the rise of music streaming. We'll look at different chart types in Tableau that you might, you know, think about using. And then, of course, assuming that we have a good data set that does show some kind of pattern. This is just a random example. I don't actually have a data set that proves any kind of correlation between annual record sales and the rise of music streaming. It's just a kind of anecdotal example that I believe has some basis in reality. So the piece right in the middle of the pyramid on top of your data and the narrative about your data is structure. Kind of how are you going to lay out and organize this information in a way that is readable, is memorable, is interesting, will engage folks, right? So details like text and color are part of this, but kind of also, again, build on top of this. So I like to kind of think about what might be a core focus, you know, of your infographic and start there, and then think about things like color palettes or where your text is going to go. So I'm showing this example on the screen. It is actually a static snapshot of an interactive Tableau visualization dashboard. So it centers on a radial chart. It's a very complex chart that shows a lot of data points. So in fact, this chart is virtually unreadable and useless in static format that I'm showing it in, but it's just to kind of demonstrate the structure of this infographic. So this is called Viz for Social Good, and they're visualizing the ways that they have helped nonprofits, that this, you know, program has helped nonprofits learn about data visualization. So it's a little bit meta, but essentially, you know, this infographic is anchored on a single, you know, a single really complex visualization. And that is the anchor point for this, the structure of this, right? And rather than, you know, having just a single paragraph or text block on the left-hand side, they have used structure to kind of break up some of the important facts and figures into smaller boxes that are kind of interesting, visually interesting, and easy to kind of parse. They've also embedded another little chart here, a little lollipop bar chart, but otherwise it really focuses on this radial diagram. But then over on the right-hand side, they've included a legend, basically a how to read this chart. So it is really important for when you're designing the structure of an infographic to think about what are the things, you know, how are you leading the readers through it? How are, for folks with visual abilities, how are you leading their eyes through it? And also how to read the chart itself. This is incredibly complex. So they kind of go through and break it down in each little piece. You know, what do the inner circles mean, the nodes? What do the arcs that connect the circle mean? How to read this? You know, each ring and like essentially, and they also have direct labels and annotations that kind of are contained to the center of the structure of this. So it's not overly cluttered. It's very clear and well organized and well structured. So I really like this example of kind of thinking about visually breaking up the components of your narrative essentially into different boxes or containers. And then text is towards the top of the pyramid, and this might seem a little controversial, right? Because the words that we use to describe our visualizations, or if, as we saw in the previous example, tell people how to interact with them and how to read them, those words are really important, right? But, and text, I think what's crucial here is that I'm using text in a different way than the narrative, right? The narrative comes lower. So the narrative in infographics is, of course, communicated not only through text, but through the charts, maps, visualizations, images, color. Its narrative kind of ties all of that together. So it's a lot more foundational. But it is really useful to kind of think about, you know, what are the most important pieces of text that you do need to include? And it can be really helpful, in addition to explaining the main argument and takeaway of the infographic, to use text to explain why the infographic is structured the way it is. to really make it clear what the story is that you're telling through maybe clever juxtaposition of different titles of charts, and then also how folks should interact. So I do think you should be using text to kind of either as part of a legend or as part of a how to read this, or maybe it's more subtle and kind of incorporated throughout in terms of instructions on how to read something. But I would never assume that a chart alone speaks for itself. It is really, really important to contextualize your visualizations and explain what the key takeaways are. So this example that I'm showing right now is also not ideal for the way that I'm displaying it right now because it is very vertical. So they have used text in this particular example, which is about solving Sudoku problems. So they've really used text to kind of lead the reader through. And so depending on the device this was displayed on, or if it's printed on a poster, folks would interact with it differently. It is intuitive to read it from top to bottom, but it helps that they have this kind of factor 1, factor 2, factor 3. So they're using text and text, in terms of titles and subtitles to make this a lot more easy to read. It's very clear that you're supposed to go, from here and then down through the vertical layout of this infographic. So text can be really helpful for that process, not only of communicating what your points are, but how folks should read the infographic. And then finally, color is both the kind of cherry on top that has the power to tie together all the other elements, but it's also something that can trip folks up. And actually in the data visualization workshop that I've given in the past, and that I shared a link to earlier in this slide deck, I get into color a lot more in detail, because good color choices are really, really essential for an infographic to be successful. Well-chosen color contrasts can highlight different parts of a chart itself or of an entire infographic. Good color palettes will allow users with all color vision abilities, right? Because some folks do have vision disabilities or color vision deficiencies. So you want to make sure that your charts are readable and understandable to your entire audience. And again, color can really unify a design and make it visually appealing. So folks kind of want to spend more time with it. So this example that I'm showing now is called the gender gap. So it's a chart and infographic that kind of visualizes the gap in access for folks of different genders. It is kind of binary in this particular example, but access to internet, and particularly in developing regions. So they're using color here, really kind of flipping it on its head as they have male access in terms of kind of in the United States, we have this like pink, blue, girl, boy binary going on, in our kind of cultural understanding, but they flip that on its head. So they're using red for male and blue for female, but they are dividing it along these lines to kind of make the chart a little more readable and see, and show where access is more separate between genders. Okay. So for some of the examples that we've seen, and for certain kinds of infographics, it might be easier to get started than in other cases, right? So in some cases, getting past the blank page can just be as simple as thinking about whether your data story lends itself really well to a particular layout. So if you do have data that changes over time, or a lot of kind of panel data, you might be looking at, you might even be constrained in terms of needing a rectangular, linear, either horizontal or vertical layout. That might not be the case for all sorts of data sets or, narratives that you want to be telling. This is a good example of kind of, if you do have data that's changing over time, like you might be constrained and want to focus on a kind of rectangular or linear layout. Another option is to think about if you might be able to use a theme for the overall data story, right? So if you do have data that's about a particular topic, like the sun or the environment, maybe you want to go with a circular or globe-shaped design. I saw a really great infographic. I couldn't find it again, but it was about garbage in the ocean, and it actually, the entire graph, it was a scatter plot where the top of the graph was like the surface of the ocean and there was a little boat up there and some fishes. And then like the farther down you got into the ocean was like the more like less common trash or things like that. So anyways, it was really catchy and visually catchy. This is another really fun example. So this is a visualization of Nintendo Switch sales. And they've actually used the layout of the physical, Switch game console as the container for their visualization. So this kind of themes it. It makes it a lot more visually engaging. You can even use a theme to kind of think about color palettes, that sort of thing. So that could be a good approach to getting off that blank page. And then it's always really, really helpful, of course, to look at other examples to kind of get inspiration, get ideas for how you might design your infographics. So there are lots of different data viz galleries out there, data journalism websites. You might see popular infographics in newspaper or magazine venues. So I have a slide here with a list of resources of places to look for inspiration. So Tableau, which we're going to turn and look to in just a second, has its own gallery of infographics created with their platform. So they have one called Visit the Day. That's a featured visualization each day. So today's is golf courses in Massachusetts. But you can kind of scroll through here and get a lot of different interesting ideas about how folks are laying out their infographics. And I've included a couple of other examples. So there's one particular Tableau user who has some really awesome example visualizations that they've created. There are data viz galleries really all over the place. A couple cool examples. The US Census Bureau has its own gallery of visualizations using census data. Visually is a fun example where they've picked a variety of different kinds of infographics and visualizations. A lot of really cool visualizations in there as well. And then from Data to Viz is another excellent website. They actually have a catalog, both a catalog of different data visualization types, chart types. So this is an excellent resource if you're not sure what the most appropriate chart type is for the data that you have. They also have this flow chart to help you make that decision. And then under data story, they actually have a number of examples for different types of data sets. What are some ways you might visualize them? And some of these include, they're more infographic oriented, but this is another great place to get some inspiration and resources. And then I've learned a lot from, some particular data journalists and data visualization experts, particularly Andy Kirk's Visualizing Data and the Storytelling with Data by Coldness Bemer-Naflick that I mentioned earlier. And of course, 538, and there's a little bit of scandal around Nate Silver, but I include this as here as well because they have some really fantastic political visualizations. Okay, I'm going to pause before we move into Tableau and double check our chat. And if there's any questions so far, feel free to paste those in chat and I will take a look. Yes, so we'll definitely talk about ways to bring in images into Tableau. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. And the Margarita has just shared again the link to these slides, so you can access all the links that I've been sharing. So definitely check that out. And I believe, unfortunately, we're not able to share hyperlinks in the YouTube chat. So I will just refer folks to the bit.ly link. If you're watching this live stream, you can access all these links here. All right, so before we dive into the actual Tableau software, I wanted to kind of mention some resources again and also talk about some of the caveats maybe that come with using this particular tool to create data visualizations and interactive dashboards. So if you are new to using Tableau, you can access the public version, the free to use version of their software at public.tableau.com. So this is a really, Tableau is a very commonly used and powerful data visualization tool. What I also like about this particular tool is they have really, really robust learning resources. So they have how-to videos, they have really robust documentation and help pages. They also, and you can always kind of, with something this complex, with something like Tableau, it's not really a question of, if you'll get stuck, it's more like when you get stuck or when you can't figure out how to do X, Y, and Z. And even I'm not an everyday Tableau user, so I'm always having to look up the little technical details of how to do things in the software. So Stack Overflow is an excellent place to look for help, where folks have kind of posted previously, questions that they've had, and folks have responded and have answered them. And then Tableau has community forums and user groups. So there's really a lot of places to get help with Tableau. So I highly recommend checking out those learning resources if you're new to this software. But before we dive in, some things to note about this. It can be a quite challenging software to learn. I'm going to do my best to kind of walk through it slowly and demystify some of the interface, but we are only going to have time to cover a few of the basics today. Something else to note, there are multiple versions of Tableau, so this can be a little bit confusing in terms of the terminology, how we're referring to these different versions. So Tableau Desktop is the paid, it's a proprietary software. You download and install, and it does require a paid subscription to use. And then there's Tableau Online, which is a browser-based visualization software that also requires a paid subscription to use. And there are bundles that they have different pricing options. But the Tableau Public is essentially the free to use version of Tableau Desktop. So it is also, you download and install it locally, but there's a lot of caveats to its use, which I'll talk about on the next slide. But I did want to point out, if you are a current full-time student, you can request a free 1-year license for the full Tableau Desktop software. And if you're teaching with Tableau, instructors at accredited academic institutions can actually request unlimited free licenses for teaching. So I would point you to the Tableau website, and they have a page about education use that you can grab the forms and things to kind of fill out to get those free licenses. But in terms of using Tableau Public, the most important thing to note about this particular tool is that apart from, just like taking a screenshot of your charts or visualizations, the only way to save and share your workbook files, your visualizations, is to publish them to tableau.com. You can make them private, and you can technically save local copies. So you can set it so you can download the workbooks from your own profile on tableau.com, but you do have to publish things to tableau.com before you can save them locally. So that is a real drawback. I acknowledge that. I think it's a strong option despite that caveat. But I wanted to make sure to call this out that you will need to create an account to download and use this software. You'll probably want to be a bit proactive in terms of if you want to keep your visualizations private, you'll have to go onto your account and change a setting. It's not automatically enabled. The default is that things will be published publicly. And most importantly, you absolutely should not upload sensitive, personally identifiable, proprietary, or any other kinds of protected data to Tableau Public, because it is not a secure storage location. So that's just a general privacy and kind of data security blanket caveat. But I still think it's an excellent choice for a lot of other use cases if you're not working with sensitive data, for example. And I do want to call attention to the fact that UCR Library is providing a new service. It is still small scale, so we're still scaling it up. But if you are affiliated with UCR and you don't otherwise have access to the full Tableau desktop software, you will be able to connect with us and request an account to use the software itself, the full version of Tableau desktop, on our virtual computer lab, Oporto, which is in conjunction with the ITS, the UCR ITS Oporto instance, and that's at the link on the slide here. And I'm, really excited to connect with folks who have questions about Tableau. So if you would like to, hop on Oporto with me and kind of work through particular questions or particular projects, or if you just want to work on your own on a particular project, that is an option. So I have a Calendly link on the screen here. I can also pop it in the chat if you would like to sign up for a consultation or participate in these office hours. But I just wanted to kind of call that out. If you are here at UCR and would like to participate in that, make use of that, that is an option. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and exit out of my my slides here, and I actually closed Tableau, so I'm going to have to open up Tableau again. So I am using the, again, Tableau Public edition of the desktop version, and it is the 2021 Q2 version of this software, so that might be slightly different if you already have this installed or an older version of it installed. And they do make really regular changes. They have a major update quarterly, so there's usually 4 updates a year. So it's useful to kind of know when you're looking at help pages and stuff, which version you're using. And then I see a question in chat. Actually, so if the person who shared that question in chat about integrating library dashboards with OPAC, if you could explain a little more what you mean by that, I'd be happy to address that question, but I'm not sure what OPAC is actually. All right, so for today, we're going to be using a couple of example data sets that I actually grabbed from Gapminder, which I mentioned earlier. The first one of those is a data set with kind of longitudinal data. This is CO2 emissions per capita for, I believe it's 191 countries from 1960 to 2014. So this is the kind of core data set that we're going to be looking at today. And then I also grabbed another data set from Gapminder that has additional information about the countries. So for example, we'll be able to use the latitude and longitude in this data set to plot things on a map. Technically Tableau can do that just with the names of the countries, but I wanted to show this as well. This also has, other information on World Bank region, that sort of thing. So this is a secondary data set, and we're going to join these 2 data sets together in Tableau, and we'll walk through how to do that. So when you first open up Tableau, you'll get the option over here on the left-hand side to connect to a variety of different types of data files. And they're called connections because technically you're not opening the exact data file that's on your computer, for example. Tableau is going to make a copy of that and connect to it kind of as if it was a remote database. So that's important to know. If you make changes to your data in Tableau, that's not going to be changing the original files. So it is useful too, if you make changes, we're going to look at how to export your data, to CSV, to Excel, if you wanted to, get data back out that you've made changes to. So we're going to go ahead and connect to the first data file today. And that is this CO2 emissions Excel spreadsheet. Okay, so once we've opened up or connected to any kind of data sets, we're going to get a little preview here. We're also going to see on the left-hand sidebar here, it's going to show us a list of our active connections and all the sheets that are inside the Excel workbook. So in this case, there's only one sheet inside this Excel workbook. So it's just this one with the CO2 data. And we're going to get a preview over here. And we'll notice, well, the first thing that I notice here is that my column names have just been automatically generated, even though we have in this first row of the data set the years. But the years have been interpreted, and this is super common in lots of different software. They've been interpreted as, just a currency amount, I believe, because it's been formatted with 2 decimal places. But in any case, it's the 1960, 1961, the years have not been interpreted correctly. So if you do have data column names in the first row, you can, Tableau is going to generate the field names automatically, but you can tell it the field names are in the first row. I just clicked on the little drop down arrow next to the name of this data set, and I will tell it that the field names are in the first row. So now our columns are accurately named. All right, so now we want to connect to our second data file, and Tableau actually makes it fairly easy to connect to data that's living in lots of different places, manipulate it, do some data cleanup, all that sorts of thing. So that's a really useful feature as well. So I'm going to connect to another Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, and this workbook does actually have many different sheets. So now There are all 5 sheets inside of that second Excel file showing up here. The one that we want is called list of countries, etc. So you can join or connect multiple data tables in Tableau in a couple ways. So you see this little, where they're showing a little prompt here in the middle of this canvas saying, need more data, drag tables here to relate them. So this is a newer feature in Tableau. So you can, if you wanted to, drag and drop, and we'll see a little connector show up to create a relationship between these 2 data tables. And as soon as we try to do that, it's going to ask us, okay, well, how do I know how to connect these 2? So if you've done any work with relational databases, this process is pretty straightforward and intuitive, but essentially we just need to tell Tableau how to connect these 2 data tables, which columns they have in common. So we want to say that country in our CO2 data matches the column name in our list of countries. So it just recognized that, and now we have a relationship here between these 2 data tables. That's not actually what we want for today's purposes. I would actually like to do a join, because if we do a join, it's going to be a lot easier for us to export data back out. Again, Tableau's not opening the files themselves. It's not making changes to the files themselves. So it's really helpful to well, I would encourage you to read about relationships and joins to kind of find out more if you're interested in this. But essentially, to get the data back out, we're going to want to do a join rather than a relationship. So this, because we're not actually making any changes, we've just told Tableau how to recognize connections between these two data tables. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this connection. Don't want it. So to create a join, which is a kind of more significant connection between the 2 tables, I'm going to click open on this particular table. And this is kind of confusing, but basically instead of dragging and dropping list of countries up here to the default area, if I drag list of countries up here, it's going to prompt Tableau to create a join between these 2 tables. Again, we have to specify how they're connected, and we don't really have time to get into all the details of this. Again, I'll point you to the Tableau help pages. But because we want to keep all the fields from both tables, we're going to do a full outer join. And again, we have to tell it that country is the field, or is the column to match on, and that aligns with the names of the countries in this table. Okay, so now I'm going to close this. So now we just have one table open, but you'll see that if we scroll over, the data from list of countries has been added to, has been joined to, and is physically, but in this data table. So we're just working with one data table, and that's going to be a lot easier. We now do have a duplicate column for the name of the country. So I'm going to go ahead and hide. I'm going to click on this little arrow up at the top of this column and just say hide this column, because we don't need it, because we have that column called country from the first data table. And then the next step here, so we have this data in a format that is actually not really ready to visualize. And we don't have time to get into kind of tidy data in full, but if you've heard of tidy data, it is a format for preparing your data to be visualized that a lot of data visualization programs expect data to be in. So right now we are not storing the variable year in its own column. Right now, we just have the names of all these columns identifying which year they're from. But to be able to visualize, for example, the relationship between change in CO2 emissions over time and the different years, we'll need this information to be stored in its own column. So basically what we want to do is we want to take this wide data and convert it, stack it, pivot it, there's different words for it, into long data. So what we want is to have Afghanistan 1960, Afghanistan 1961, et cetera, et cetera. So it'll be a much longer data set, more rows, but that's going to be the format we need it to be in to visualize it easily. So Tableau lets you do this. I think it's awesome. Not a lot of data viz software has the ability to do data pivots built in. So what I'm going to do is highlight. So I've clicked on 1960. I'm going to scroll over here to 2014 and highlight. I'm using shift click to highlight all of my CO2 emission columns. And I'm going to click on any of the arrows at the top of any of them and select pivot. And what this is going to do is Tableau is going to go through and create a lot of duplicate rows. And then we have to scroll over here to the right. And what happens is we end up with those values being stored in a column called pivot field values. And then the year information is now stored in pivot field names. So this is exactly what we want. We're just going to rename these to be year and CO2 emissions. Again, these are in, I'm not sure if I said this, they're in metric tons per capita. Okay, so now our data is pretty much in the format that we want it to be in to start visualizing it. And I know that was kind of a lot to get the data ready before we even started. And we're gonna have to create a couple of charts before we can make an infographic, but I'm hoping that kind of walking through these different steps will be helpful. And I apologize if you hear my cat in the background. He has just woken up from a nap and is running around. Okay, so our data is ready to go. Right now, this list of all the connections is kind of messy. So what I want to do is export what we just created as a new spreadsheet, as a CSV file. And then I'm going to open that up so it's a little cleaner and we only see the fields in this particular table. So I'm going to go ahead and go up to data in the file menu. And I'm going to go down to export data to CSV and select this table that we're looking at. And you can choose where to put it. I did this earlier, so I already have a joined CO2 geography file on my desktop. So I'm going to just overwrite this with the one that we just made. It exported the data to file. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and go up to file and just close the connections that we currently have open. And it should pop us back to the home page. Okay. So now what I want to do, because a CSV file, a comma separated values file is, it's a format of text file. So to reopen that, I'm going to go to text file and go up to my desktop where I have that joined file and reopen that. So now we're going to see in our data source tab, and I should have mentioned there's a little navigation pane down here at the bottom of the screen. Now we're seeing this combined data table with the name that I saved it out as. So it's a little cleaner here. We don't have to worry about all those extra sheets in that data geographies Excel workbook that we weren't going to work with. Okay, any questions so far about data manipulation? I'll keep an eye on chat. But essentially, so before we go ahead and start creating a more complex kind of Tableau dashboard or infographic, what we want to do is make a couple of charts that are visualizing relationships in this data, and then we'll be able to combine those charts together on the dashboard. So you can click over into using this bottom navigation menu. There's always going to be a sheet 1 that is generated just as a blank canvas for creating a chart or map or other kind of visualization, and you can create as many sheets as you want. So there's a button here for new worksheets, and worksheets just where you're making charts in Tableau. You can also up on the file menu, once you are clicked into any kind of sheet, worksheet will show up and you can create a new worksheet here. So I'll go ahead and create, I'll create 2 for now because we want to make a couple of different charts to incorporate into our dashboard. Okay, before we start making a chart, I did want to mention a couple of things about this interface and about the way that Tableau stores the data. So this is the canvas where we're going to be dragging and dropping things and creating our charts. And then over here on the left-hand side, where before we saw kind of our list of connections, now we see a list of the fields or columns or variables that are in our current data set. And as I'm hovering over them, some of them are highlighting in blue and some of them are highlighting in green. So Tableau stores your fields as either dimensions or measures. And if you're familiar with like the difference between categorical and sequential data, that is essentially what this is. Sometimes it's called discrete versus sequential. So essentially that's how Tableau is storing these different kinds of data, and what measures are, so the green ones, those are variables that literally measure some attribute of your data. And those have to be numerical. They're exclusively numerical, essentially quantitative. But the blue dimensions can be text. They could be, they're just values that describe some attribute of your data. So they could be categories, they could be geographical or temporal scales, they could be other types of variables, and anything that's not a strict measurement of something. Yes, dimensions and measures. And this is kind of confusing. Tableau used to have it nicely divided, and it said dimensions and measures over here on the left, but now they just give you one big list called tables. And then we also get some that are automatically generated. So any of these that have italicized names are automatically generated fields. And you can use them like you would the fields that are actually in your data. And it's funny because we have a column in our data set that Tableau has recognized as spatial data. So on the left, we'll see these different icons next to the different fields, and those indicate the data type that Tableau is storing them as. So it's a little globe icon, and I apologize, it's kind of small on my screen, but it looks like a globe, and it's next to country as well as latitude and longitude. So Tableau has recognized that that is spatial data. We'll see a little ABC next to just regular kind of text categorical data. We'll see a little calendar next to things stored as dates, and then a pound sign next to things stored as numbers. And there's different kinds of numbers. So, you know, I'm noticing here that year, which is actually, you know, kind of it's a categorical, it's a dimension essentially, but Tableau, because it just sees a 4-digit number, 1960, you know, it assumed that that's a number. So we can go ahead and manually change the data types. And this is actually necessary for Tableau to be able to recognize, oh yeah, you should be able to use that field to create this particular kind of chart, because it's not the smartest software. It's pretty smart. Like it goes and it recognizes that Afghanistan is a country, and it went and looked them up, all the countries, and created this latitude and longitude. So in fact, you can just literally drag country onto the canvas. Tableau recognizes its spatial data, and it will create a map. So I say it's not that smart, but it's also pretty smart. So that's essentially the difference between dimensions and measurements. Other things I need to mention about dimensions or measurements. Oh yes, we want to change year, which is currently highlighted in green. So it's being interpreted as a measure. I want to change this to a dimension. And in fact, I want to change it to a date. And if we wanted to change it, I can right click on it or click on that drop down and convert to discrete. So now it's being recognized as a date, a dimension. It's categorical. These are not, you know, sequential numbers, 1960 to 2014. They are essentially categories that we want to be able to visualize as categories or along a timeline. Okay, so we've got a simple map. And I demonstrated creating this by dragging and dropping the country field right onto the canvas. There's a couple different ways to generate charts and maps in Tableau, and the simplest is dragging and dropping. So that's really kind of what the interface is designed for you to do. You can also double click. So if I click over into a blank sheet, this time I'm going to double click country. It's the same as dragging and dropping, but you don't have to, you know, if you don't have a good mouse or something like that on your computer, you can just double click. You don't have to worry about dragging here and there. So that is useful to know. I'm actually just going to delete this sheet. And then you can also, there's something up in the top right hand called Show Me. So if you click on Show Me, this is going to give you a kind of gallery of all the different types of charts and tables and maps that Tableau will let you make. And they're all grayed out right now because the second primary way, aside from, you know, dragging and dropping or clicking, double clicking, is to highlight the fields that you want to use. So for example, if I wanted to use latitude and longitude, I just control clicked because I'm on a PC, you can command click to highlight both of them. And the only chart that's showing up that Tableau recognizes, because it recognizes that this is spatial data, is the map. So I could click on that and it will do the same-ish thing as it did when I dragged country over, except, and this is another really common thing Tableau does, it tries, and it being smart and also not smart at the same time, it tries to assume, it tries to guess, you know, whether you want to display the actual values in your data set or some kind of calculated value. So here it's averaging the longitude, which it doesn't need to do. So you can just change that back to the attribute, oops, I'm sorry, to the dimension itself. This isn't strictly necessary for this particular data value, but it will be it's just useful, you know, you don't want to be summing things if you're not trying to sum things or averaging things. So keep an eye on that. You will see Tableau do calculations for you even when you don't want it to. So those are the two main ways to generate a chart or a map. So we'll actually notice, and this is kind of cool. So in the generated values, the lat and long are slightly different. So we'll notice, for example, the center of Mexico is different in the Tableau generated than in our own data set where we have our own lat long. So it didn't really matter which ones of these we use. I'm just going to delete one of them, but we essentially have our map. But really all we have now are just points indicating where these countries are. Not super helpful, right? So we want to kind of visualize the information we have in this data set, which is about you know, CO2 emissions per capita for different countries over the span of 1960 to 2014. So what we can do is we can add additional measures or dimensions to our map or chart. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and drag. I would like to change the appearance of these map marks based on CO2 emissions per capita. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this right onto the canvas. And Tableau assumes, or it guesses, that we want to scale the size of the points based on CO2 emission values. It assumed that we wanted to sum them. But because I know that in this data set, we don't have completely even coverage for all the countries for all of the years, sum's probably not a very representative calculation to perform. So instead, we can change this to average. So I'm going to go into this drop down and change it from measure sum to average. So now it's calculating the average CO2 emission values for each country. And it is mapping that onto size. So in fact, these are actually kind of small circles. So we can also bump up the size of all the circles relative to each other. So they're a little easier to see. And that can be useful. And we also notice that Tableau automatically generates a legend whenever you add another dimension or measure to your chart that correlates to a field. It will add a legend for that. And you know, if we wanted, we could also color the points on our map for emission values as well. So I'm just going to drag again, drag and drop CO2 emissions to color here in this little marks pane. This is controlling how the marks appear on the map. And it also generates a color scale and pops that into the legend and is now coloring the points on the map again by summing CO2 emissions. So we're gonna have to change that again to average to match how we're scaling the size. And now we have maybe a more useful sort of map where we are, you know, displaying for each country what's the average CO2 emission. So the very next thing that I want to do is to clarify what this chart is about, right? So I'm going to go ahead and rename this sheet so I remember which sheet it is, because you might get a lot of sheets going. So it's good to rename them. I'm going to call it map. And then I'm going to give this chart a more descriptive title. So whenever you click on any text in Tableau, you're going to get this little text editor pop up. And it is a pretty robust text editor. So you can change font, you can change font size, you can do some simple formatting, change font color, etc. And what's really cool is you can insert field names or data values right into your text editor. So I don't really want that for the chart title. I'm just going to call this chart average global CO2 emissions 1960 to 2014. So give it a descriptive title so it's clear to you and to your readers what this chart is representing. Okay, so we've got a kind of usable map. We can, if we want, change the color palette, color scale. And I go over the difference between color palettes and color scales in the Data Viz workshop that I gave in August. That's on our UCR library YouTube channel. So check that out if you're like, why is she saying palette sometimes and scale sometimes? Thanks for joining us, folks, if you have to hop off early. So we can also edit the colors by clicking on color. There are a number of preset scales, both diverging and sequential, that we could choose from. Since, you know, climate change is no joke, I might choose red for this particular example. So we're going to scale with darker red being higher per capita average emission values for this particular data set. Okay, so I'm happy with this map. We are getting one unknown. There's a missing data in our data sets. So we could go in and fix that. You can also just exclude it, filter it out. So that's a really helpful thing to do sometimes. So I'm just going to go ahead and ignore whatever that null value was that was popping up in our data. So I want to create another sheet because we want at least one more chart to play with as we create our dashboard. So we've got a map that's kind of representing average CO2 emissions for this 54-year time period. We might also want to kind of visualize, since we do have this longitudinal information, how have CO2 emission values changed over time, to kind of have a temporal correlation or example in addition to the spatial one. So rather than dragging and dropping, let's look at, again, highlighting different fields and seeing what the Show Me gallery suggests for us to use in terms of a chart type for this. So we want to use year. We want to visualize CO2 emissions per capita over time. So I've highlighted those two fields, and now we're getting a variety of different chart types. We could make a bar chart. We could make, different types of charts. And the orange box here is recommending that we use this, this version of a line chart. I'm going to just start with this for demonstration purposes, a regular line chart. So I'm going to click on the type of chart I want to create, and Tableau, again, is like, okay, you want to make a line chart. You got a lot of data points, so I'm going to sum them. So it again assumed that we wanted to sum the CO2 emission for all the countries. But we could, if we wanted, have a line on this chart for each individual country and its change over time. We again have some null values. I'm going to ignore that for now. So if you wanted to add country as an additional dimension to this chart, you can drag and drop country on here onto the canvas. And Tableau is going to take that and say, okay, so you want a line for each country in your data set. This is fairly unusable, even in interactive format, right? So in static format, this is an ultimately garbage chart, right? You can't tell any data points. Like you could maybe tell if we labeled this, that this is a high 1963 maybe, but it's kind of an incomplete, axis. So this is not really a usable chart. So country may not be the way to go, but luckily we have from our joined data table, all these other ways of kind of grouping countries into different regions. So I'm going to actually just click on country and drag it back over here to remove it from the chart. Go back to that, summarized line graph. And I'm going to pick World Bank region. I believe that has the most, I believe it's the same as 8 regions, but we're going to go with World Bank region and drag that on here. And so now, because Tableau recognized that this is a dimension, which means it's categorical data, so it's going to use a color palette versus a color scale. So these colors are very different. They're not like, for example, ranging from pale yellow to dark yellow. They're all very different, and that's what you want. You want a color palette for categorical data. There's also some null values in here. So at this point, I'm going to get rid of those. We don't want to be visualizing the null values. In reality, I would go and clean up my data and make sure I know what I'm throwing away. But for this purpose, I'm just going to click on the legend over here, click on null, and just click exclude. I could also do it by clicking down here, but I demonstrated that earlier. So you can do it right here from the legend. Oh, and there's still some nulls within one of these categories, so we're going to have to do it anyway. All right, filter those 3 values out. Okay, so now we have a much more readable line graph, especially in interactive format, because someone can hover over and read the information in this tooltip, and it's a much more robust way of representing the information. It's much more readable, right? I'll also note that you can customize what appears in this tooltip, so that you could do over here in the marks. So if we wanted to customize what's appearing in our tooltip, by default, it's showing all the variables that are being plotted, and it's doing the silly year of year thing. But we can add on another variable if we wanted. So we could, none of them really make sense to include for this particular one. So actually, let me pop back over to the map, and I'm going to customize the tooltip here. So if we wanted, for example, we could add the Latin long coordinates to our tooltip. So we can go right in here, and this is where you'll want to insert the values for a particular field. So we can insert latitude and insert longitude, and then hit OK. So now when someone hovers over a point on the map, it has those additional data values in it. So that's, it's useful to customize sometimes. Okay, so we've got a line chart here. Let's go ahead and rename this sheet. And of course, we want to give our chart a descriptive title. So we're going to call these global. And in this case, we are summing. We do want it to say sum. So we'll total global CO2 emissions per capita by world region. Okay. All right, so now we've got a couple of charts to play with. Let's go ahead and look at how you assemble these into a dashboard. So I want to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions and things. All right, so once you've got some sheets, some visualizations or charts and maps, you can, down here on the navigation bar, click New Dashboard. You could also go up to the File menu and click New Dashboard. And again, we get a kind of canvas over on the right-hand side and a list. This time, instead of a list of our data fields, we have a list of the sheets that we've made and can add to our dashboard. We also can control a lot of different aspects of the dashboard, how it appears, as well as add additional objects. So in addition to dragging our charts and maps that we've made onto this canvas, we can add text boxes, we can add images, we can embed web pages, you can add kind of blank buffer boxes, you can add all sorts of buttons for kind of navigation and downloading. This is where it gets, I mean, I know Tableau has been a little complex up to this point as well, but it really gets complex in terms of building, well, there's just a lot of possibilities if you want to kind of dive into all the features that Tableau offers in terms of making really intricate dashboards. And in fact, let's just very briefly pop over to the Tableau gallery, OOA tools, to look at an example dashboard just to see how it displays online. So these are all dashboards that folks have made, just like we were doing in Tableau, by combining text, combining maps, as well as other types of charts. So this looks like they're using a kind of vertical linear layout, and we'll see how to do that. Looks like they've just got the two charts. This is actually very similar to what we're gonna make in a second, but it can get very complex. Let's see if we can find a more complex one. Okay, and this is an excellent example because this is using a different layout, a different way of, so you'll notice this is not automatically, I'm gonna have to either go and find their scroll bar or resize my browser window to be able to view the entire infographic at once. And the reason for that, if we go back to Tableau, is based on how they're sizing or sizing and laying out the infographic. So with size, this is the kind of place you want to start when you open up a new dashboard, is determine how large it's going to be and how it's going to display. So you have a couple of options. You can create a fixed size infographic, and that's exactly what we just saw with the most recent example I had up, this is a fixed size infographic. It's still interactive, but we're only seeing a small corner of it because they decided it was going to be a certain pixel width and height, and it was not going to resize. Most of the time people do that when they have a background image, because you want the background image to kind of, you know, appear correctly in the different parts of the infographic. So fixed is an excellent option where you specify the exact size. If you know exactly where and how your dashboard's going to be displayed, and you want it to be, you know exactly what size it's going to be displayed at, so that you avoid the issue that we just saw where we couldn't see it, you know, on my laptop screen. You can also set a range of sizes for your dashboard. This is an excellent option if you're going to be displaying infographics on, for example, a mobile device. So, you know, tablets and phones, you could have it, they all have different widths, right? So you could kind of have it be a variable width to fit different sorts of devices. And then, you know, if you have a long kind of vertical scrolling layout, you know, you can have a fixed maximum height, essentially. So range is excellent. You can kind of, you know, for example, in that instance, I would turn off the, well, I would fix the height at whatever vertical height you have, and then it would automatically resize with to fit whoever's, you know, phone is looking at this. And then there's a third option for size that is called automatic, and this is probably where you want to go, but you'll need to be mindful then of where you're placing things in the dashboard, because it's going to automatically resize to fit any screen. So that's good. It will dynamically generate your infographic, and whether someone's looking on a mobile device or on a really large monitor, it's going to fit their screen and they'll be able to interact with it. So that's a good option in terms of accessibility and readability, but it will also just expand your charts to fit whatever size. There's no maximum size. So that can kind of get a little, you know, screwy with how, you know, the placement of particular things. So if you do need things to be very fixed, you might want to go with the fixed option. Again, this is really kind of complex in terms of laying out. So I will point you all to the excellent Tableau help pages. There's a really, this one in particular is really excellent. So I would recommend, if you're curious about these different options for sizing and laying out your dashboard, you know, especially if you want to include images, you want to include more complex content, this is a good place to start. But basically to demonstrate how this works, how you start to get content into a dashboard and create and build an infographic in this tool, we'll go ahead and use an automatically sized. So we're going to have slightly less control over where things appear depending on, you know, people's screen size. But we can use what are the horizontal and vertical container blocks. So we can force things to either appear on top of or below each other or side by side. So since we've got a map and a line chart, so I'm going to go ahead and go with, I would like them to kind of vertically stack like that Australian example we just saw. So I'm going to drag and drop a vertical container onto my dashboard. So it is just an empty box, but it's going to help us control how things are rendered when someone views this in their browser. And again, any of these dashboards that you create, any of the visualizations, anything you create in Tableau Public are going to be, they're going to be published to tableau.com, and that's how people are going to interact with them. And we'll also look at, you know, how to share things as well. So I'm going to go ahead and drag into this box. I'm going to drag my map, and it's going to fill up the entire dashboard at first. Because these legends don't really add anything to the legibility of this map, especially with our tooltip, I'm going to go ahead and just delete them, remove them from the dashboard. But they were automatically added when I added the map. So I'm just clicking on them and clicking X to remove. And then as soon as you try and add a second element to your dashboard, so when I click on this line chart and I'm going to drag it over here, Tableau is going to kind of ask you, okay, well, where do you want it? Do you want it at the top of the box, left side, right side, or bottom of the box? So I would like this to appear below the map. So I'm releasing that here. And now we've got also the legend for this line chart on the right. But instead, I would like this to actually appear, I would like to move the legend. So I'm going to grab the legend box and actually move it. And I'm just hovering over different parts of this container. So I want the legend to kind of appear side by side with the line chart. So now we've got this, and you can kind of customize all these elements. We don't have time to go in, like, the purpose here isn't for me to make a pretty infographic today. It's just to kind of get you all started in the functionality of the software. But you can resize all these boxes relative to each other within this container. Again, they will resize on somebody's screen if we've used the automatic layout. And let's see, what else? So you can drag and drop all sorts of items in here. So you can show the dashboard title. I would recommend that. So you can give your whole infographic a title. We'll decide what that's going to be in a second. You can drag blank boxes on here to kind of create buffers and separate things. So if I want to have a little space between my map, not that much space, a little space between my map, and this is also a little scrunched now, between my map and my line chart, we can do that. So now there's kind of a gap there that can be helpful. And what I always recommend folks do is add a text box somewhere, usually it's at the bottom of your infographic, but you always want to include your data citation. So where did we get this data from? What is the data that we're visualizing here? All that sort of information, so that somebody can kind of, follow the breadcrumbs and know what they're looking at. So I'm going to drag that onto the bottom of the infographic, and I have this over on in another window. I've got my data citation that I'm going to just copy and paste in here. So I have information on the two data sets that we're using in here. We can format this again, change font, change color, all of that. And we don't need it to be that big. So I'm going to resize that to be just at the bottom, and it's gonna resize, so it doesn't really matter. Okay, so we've got the kind of foundational, elements of our infographic laid out here. But what's really, really fantastic about the fact that these are interactive is that we can set them to interact with each other. So we can set it so that when somebody clicks on a point on the map, that the line chart updates. And this gets really, really awesome. The more kind of complexity you have in here, it really just adds to the reader's experience because they can kind of explore the data on their own, right? So the way that you set a visualization to cause, trickling or cascading interaction in other visualizations is to set it as a filter. So I'm just clicking on this map and I have it selected in my dashboard. And over in this little itty bitty bar here with icons, there is a funnel icon and it says use as filter. So I want to click that so that I'm now using this map as a filter for the rest of my visualizations. So now when I click on a point on the map, it's filtering out just that data point from the lower graph. You may have noticed though, when I did that, so the scale, the y-axis here for CO2 emissions per capita changed when I selected an individual country. So this is, not ideal because it's not easy for someone to kind of compare across the multiple different countries, right? If it's constantly rescaling. So we can freeze this axis. So I'm going to click on the axis itself. And this is, this is true across charts. Basically, each element can be really highly customized. I'm just kind of, again, scratching the surface with functionality today, but I can right click on this axis, select edit axis, and I can go up here and rather than having the range for the axis be automatically generated, I can set it to fixed. So that's interesting. There shouldn't be a negative value, but I want it to start at 0 and end with whatever the highest data value is in its current state. So I will close this. Oh, it's so close to the zoom. Okay, I can't, this is bad. I have to hide, I'm sorry. The X to close out of this box is right behind the stop share button. So I don't want to stop sharing, I'm not done yet. So I need to hide my floating meeting controls. Okay, apologies. Okay, so we have fixed this now. So when we click on a country, the scale stays the same. And when someone views this, so this is not ideal, but we're really scrunching up this, this chart, but it's going to actually, again, since we're using an automatic layout, it's going to appear different to different people. So it will appear larger. when we actually go to view this. So what I want to do now, I want to give this a title. And I know we're coming up on time, so if you have additional questions, definitely feel free to paste those in chat now. And then once I show how we share and export this, I can totally address any lingering questions you'll have. So I'm going to give this chart or this dashboard a name. I'm going to call it how have you can, again, customize this. So I can make this, if I wanted, bold to align with the kind of red color scheme we have going on there. And now I would like to save this. So again, you'll need to create an account. I'm logged in with my personal Tableau account. So I'm going to go up to File and click Save to Tableau Public As, and I'm going to call this Tableau Workshop 2021. And it has a little caveat here, right, that publishing this workbook is going to make it available on their website. So make sure it doesn't contain any kind of sensitive data. I will click Save, and now it's going to export this dashboard up to my Tableau account. And so it automatically moved over to my Firefox browser, and it's going to show us what it looks like. So again, I haven't added any kind of background image, any kind of formatting, so it's not the most attractive. And this is actually really excellent. So to force this legend for this line chart to appear to the right-hand side of the line chart, I actually should have put it inside of a horizontal container, because right now everything's just going to kind of scale up to fit. So it's like, we're going to make this line chart as big as we can. So to fix this, what I would do is I would create, my dashboard, make it automatic, add my vertical container, because I still want the map to appear on top of the line chart. I'm going to drag my map on, but now I'm going to go ahead and delete these really quickly. Now I would like to create a horizontal container, drag that onto the bottom here, and that's where I would put my line chart. So this is where it gets kind of, you want to make sure like you kind of check out the help pages in terms of sizing and laying out dashboards. Again, this just scratches the surface, but that's what I would do to force those two things to appear side by side, was put them in their own horizontal container. Okay, so now this this visualization is in my account on my Tableau public.tableau.com. Apologies. And if I wanted to, if you want to go in and change your privacy settings, you can go to your account and click Settings, and you can set it so when you're saving that all of your visualizations and dashboards are default to hidden to private. They won't appear to other people. And you can also enable the downloading of your data. So if you have these both enabled, which I recommend in your account settings. So now when I uploaded this this workbook, it is by default invisible. No one can see it. I can set it to visible by clicking here. Well, it might be because I have it like open in multiple places that it's a little wonky with this, but that's how you change the privacy settings of an individual visualization. And you can also share it. So if you click on view, or you can download it. So this is the only way really to download local copies on your own computer of the files. So you would click on this button to download this Tableau workbook, and then you would be able to open it on a later date. And yes, once it's published, you can edit it. That's an excellent question in chat. So you can continue to make changes. So if I made changes to this and then I saved it again, it would give me the warning like, oh, you're about to overwrite your existing one, and then it would update on your profile online. You can also edit it right here in the browser, and that is a new feature. So that's something really cool. So if I open it back up, there should be an edit button. Yep. And I didn't push the change to make that legend appear on the right-hand side of the line chart, but there is now a kind of in-browser editing interface here. So if you just need to make a quick change, you can go ahead and do that right in publictableau.com, which is a really awesome feature, I think. Any other questions about Tableau, about anything we talked about today? I'm going to pop back over here to these slides just to wrap up and make sure you all know where to contact us if you have additional questions. So in this slide here, I have some recommendations for other visualization platforms. If you're like, Tableau just seems like it's a bit much for my particular purposes, you might want to look into something that's a bit less complex and easier to kind of get off the ground. These will be a little bit less robust though in terms of the features that are offered. So Canva, Piktochart, Data Wrapper is more for individual, highly customizable, interactive online charts, less for infographics. Like Canva and Piktochart are great for, you know, combining multiple visualizations and graphics. And then I have some links here to great sources for openly licensed and free to use images and graphics. So the Noun project is an excellent source of icons and things. If you're looking for, you know, what are, you know, images that I can legally reuse in my visualizations, right? Especially if you're sharing them online, you want to make sure you're not infringing on anyone's copyright if you're using, you know, images that you're finding online. So these are great sources of openly licensed images. Again, and I think Margarita has shared a couple of times in chat the link to our YouTube, where we, our YouTube channel, and of course, if you are on YouTube, you know, you're already there, where we're storing our workshop recordings. You can also check out our Eventbrite for additional upcoming workshops and digital scholarship meetups. We also have there's additional resources on campus, of course. So I have a link here to GradQuants workshops for graduate students. We've got, you know, hacky hours if you have questions about, you know, more of the data side of things or programming. And you can always get in touch with us by requesting a consultation on our library website under Research Services and Ask a Librarian. Again, the link to these slides is here. And then just, I'll stick around if folks have questions. You know, specific questions, feel free to post those in chat or connect with me, email me. But if you have 30 seconds to just take a very, very quick 2-question survey, that would be super helpful for us to find out from you all, you know, what are other things you want to learn about? What could we, you know, have addressed today that we didn't address? I didn't really get into a lot of the kind of image formatting and stuff, but I'm hoping this is a good starting point to demystify at least a very complex software interface. So thank you all for being here. I will stick around for a few minutes and double check the live stream as well if folks have questions over on YouTube. So thank you all for being here. Oh, for folks who are still in the room, I forgot to mention over on I have to hide the meeting controls again. On Tableau, if you want to share your visualizations, okay, and this is now viewable. So you can, actually, no, I should have stayed in here. You can click at the very bottom, or actually it's up at the top here too. There is a link icon up here where you can share and embed code. So you can embed your Tableau visualizations and charts other places. And you can also get a permanent link to where this exact, you know, dashboard lives on your profile. Oh, other question. Instructing students to link the Tableau infographics they created. Okay, so I hope I just answered that with this. Once you've created your infographic and published it to your account, you go into the actual, you know, infographic, or sorry, the visualization, and you click this little link icon for sharing. And then they could link to it with just a hyperlink. Or if there's different platforms, you know, if like they have personal websites, you could grab this embed code and embed it anywhere, you know, you have control over the kind of HTML where you could kind of plug in an iframe, that sort of thing. Excellent question. Any other last minute questions? I'll just double check on YouTube. Not seeing any questions from the live stream. So thank you all for tuning in. I hope you all have a good rest of your week. Yes, the recording for this will be on YouTube in a couple of weeks. It takes us a little while. We want to make sure the captions are accurate so they're accessible for folks. and then they will be on the UCR Library YouTube channel on our workshops playlist. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.